Number 2, you're important to God because of what you cost. Now, we've talked about already the relationship between value and love. You can't love someone that you don't value. Value infers the possibility of a cost. So that we love someone that we value, more times than not, there is a cost that's attached to that love. Whether it's in terms of time, or money, or heartbreak, or disappointment, usually there is cost associated with that love. So let's think about the attributes, at least 3 attributes of the love that God has for us. First, He loved us first. The Bible tells us that He loved us before the foundation of the world, that He loved us before we were ever formed in our mother's womb. He loved us before we ever knew there was a God. He loved us before we ever responded to Him. He loved us first. Secondly, He loves us all equally. Think about Christ's life here on earth. Christ is God. He came from God, and yet the bulk of His time spent here on earth, He spent with the wrong crowd. He spent time with at least 2 adulteresses that we know about. He invited Himself to a party at a scum-of-the-earth tax collector's house where He was called a drunk. He lived His whole life down on a par with the sick, with the infirmed, with the diseased, with the twisted, with the sinners, with the outcasts of society. And He loves equally the saint and the sinner, the rich and the poor, the homeless and the mansion dweller. He loves us all the same. He loves us all equally. Thirdly, He loves us with an unconditional love. Unconditional love simply means that there is nothing that we can do to make God love us more. But just as importantly, there is nothing that we can do wrong that ever surprises Him. Then there's nothing that we can do that diminishes His love for us one bit. And just as a parent continues to love their child, when they decide to leave home against their wishes and decides to live their life in a very ungodly way, that love continues to follow them, and so it is with God. That regardless of what we have done, regardless of what we do, He still loves us. And He loves us unconditionally. We're just kids. I'm 10. He's 9. And we're just goofing off, throwing rocks at each other on a construction site. Not big rocks. And I certainly don't mean to hit him. At least not in the eye. So now I'm running to help him back up the hill to the boarding school dormitory. And I think the worst is over. but it's not. That evening, Larry's legs collapse, and he'll never walk again without the aid of crutches and braces. Frankly, I don't understand how getting hit in the eye with a small rock can make Larry crippled. But it has. And I don't need anybody to tell me it's my fault. The guilt is absolutely unbearable. It takes time, of course. But gradually that volcanic emotional eruption begins to subside. Larry and I are still best friends. He tells me it's okay. Don't worry about it. Accidents happen. But the guilt is still here. Looking back, no one knew about the guilt. No one understood that I needed an explanation. So it was several years before I began to comprehend the difference between getting hit in the eye with a small rock and contracting the deadly disease of polio. In my young mind, Larry continued to love me as his best friend. Still brings tears to my eyes. But he continued to love me in spite of the terrible, terrible loss I had caused him. He loves me. He loved me unconditionally. And God loves you unconditionally. Some of you know my number one son, Terry, as opposed to my number two son, Bobby. Terry is a master magician. He's won several awards. He's been published. He's been invited twice to the White House for their annual Easter egg roll to perform there. On his first visit, he had the opportunity to meet Laura Bush and have his picture taken with her. So when he got back home to Nashville, one of the local papers picked it up and published the story and the picture under the headline, Hedges meets Bush. But several years ago, Terry and his family and Bobby and his family came with Phyllis and I, and we traveled in this huge RV out to Branson, Missouri for a week of vacation. It was an interesting trip. Bobby's shaking his head. While we were out there, we stayed with Phyllis's two aunts, Vivian and Donna. And one day, while we were there, Donna was able to get some reduced tickets to one of the big magic shows there in Branson. Rick Van Burke, who advertises himself as the Prince of Magic. Some of you may have been out there and seen him. But he does big tricks. He plays with tigers. He flips motorcycles. He even lands a helicopter on the stage. So we got to the theater that evening, and while we were in the lobby waiting for the auditorium doors to open up, Terry does what he always does. He begins to entertain the people that are standing around him. Now, what none of us knew was that During all of this, Kirby's manager came out to the lobby to kind of check things out, see how things were going, and he notices this crowd over here around Terry. And so he walks over and he watches Terry for a little while. And then he disappears. And in a few minutes, he reappears. Come on, folks. Magic disappears, reappears. You'll get it. You'll get it. So anyway, Kirby's manager comes up to Terry and he says to him, Kirby would like to know if you would be willing to come up on stage during intermission and entertain the folks who stay in the auditorium during the intermission. Well, what do you think? Terry accepted? Yes or no? Yes, absolutely. So after the show, Kirby himself comes to Terry and says, I want to offer you a job. Now this is a huge deal to Terry because it represents more money than he's ever made. And the visibility would be phenomenal. And for a magician, visibility is everything. So Kirby says, come back to the theater tomorrow and we'll work out the details and put pen to paper. So when Terry got back to the house after his meeting with Kirby that next day, to say the least, there was not an excited look on his face. He told us that among the many conditions that Kirby had placed on him were some conditions that would have required him to be separated from his family, from his wife and children, for weeks, perhaps months at a time. His kids were pre-adolescent at the time. And so because of the value, because of the importance that Terry placed on his family, he turned the offer down. Terry paid a huge price that day because of the value that he placed on his children and his wife. God loves you more than you know. And He loves you because of what you cost. In fact, because of the value that He places on you, you cost Him the life of His Son.